The champagne was vintage, a 2012 Bollinger that I had personally sent over to the gallery, but the way my daughter-in-law, Elena, held the flute told me everything I needed to know. She held it like a scepter, not a gift. The launch party for Aurelius Tech was a sea of sleek black turtlenecks and artificial light, a monument to a vision I had funded with a wire transfer of $500,000 3 months prior. My son, Julian, was across the room, beaming, finally the man he always dreamed of being. I approached the velvet rope of the VIP section, a section my capital had built, and that's when Elena stepped forward. She didn't reach out to hug me. She didn't even smile. She simply placed a manicured hand on my forearm, a gesture meant to guide a stray child, and leaned in close enough for me to smell her expensive, sterile perfume. "We've decided to keep this circle tight tonight. Evelyn," she whispered, her voice a polished blade. "We're focusing on founding family and future institutional investors. It's a branding thing. We'll do a nice quiet dinner at the house next month, just us." I looked at her, then passed her to my son, who suddenly found a very interesting conversation with a venture capitalist from Palo Alto. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The security guard, a young man who didn't know my name or my balance sheet, stepped slightly more firmly into my path. Elena gave me a dismissive pat on the arm and turned her back. Most women my age would have gasped. They would have made a scene, or perhaps let a single, wounded tear fall to the gallery floor. I did neither. I simply took a slow sip of the air, felt the weight of the silence I was about to deploy, and realized that Elena had made the fatal mistake of treating a silent partner as a silent person. I wasn't being excluded from a party. I was being released from a contract. I walked out of that gallery with a grace that felt like silk. The cool night air of the city hit my face, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt the thrill of being underestimated. People see a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and a preference for cashmere, and they assume the mind has softened along with the jawline. They see a grandmother, and they think of cookies and compliance. They forget that the hands now knitting sweaters once balanced the ledgers of a logistics firm that survived 3 recessions and a hostile takeover in the 90s. I didn't inherit my wealth, and I certainly didn't stumble into it. I built it through the disciplined accumulation of boring assets, warehousing, cold storage, the literal foundations of commerce. I spent 30 years reading the fine print that men in expensive suits tried to gloss over. I learned early on that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who listens until the talkers have exhausted their lies. Julian is my only son, and I wanted to believe he had my marrow. When he came to me with Aurelius Tech, he didn't bring a business plan. He brought a dream. I told him then, as we sat in my study, that I do not fund dreams. I fund structures. I told him the $500,000 was an investment in his infrastructure, not a gift for his ego. He nodded, he signed, and he let Elena pick out the font for the invitations. He thought he was humoring an old woman's need for paperwork. He didn't realize that, to me, paperwork is the only honest conversation left in the world. As I sat in the back of my car on the ride home, I didn't call Julian. I didn't text Elena to express my hurt. Hurt is a vibration. I prefer a vacuum. Silence is a specialized tool. It creates a space that the guilty feel compelled to fill with their own noise. By the time I reached my front door, I had already mentally opened the mahogany filing cabinet in my office. I knew exactly where the convertible note sat. I knew the specific wording of Section 4, Paragraph C, regarding governance and information rights. Elena wanted a night for founding family and institutional investors. I found it fascinating that she didn't realize those two things were, in this specific instance, the exact same person. She saw a mother-in-law to be managed. I saw a default event waiting to be triggered. When you spend a lifetime building, You learn that it takes years to pour a foundation, but only a few seconds to pull the right pin. I went to my kitchen, poured a glass of room temperature water, and sat in the dark for 20 minutes. I wasn't grieving the relationship. I was reviewing the math. They had mistaken my generosity for a soft landing, never imagining that the cushion was actually a net, and I was the one holding the ropes. The next morning, the sun rose with a cold, clinical precision that matched my mood. I did not wake up with a heavy heart. I woke up with a clear calendar. My house in the hills is a place of deliberate silence, a structure built on the profits of things people take for granted. The logistics of moving grain, the storage of medical supplies, the unglamorous bones of the economy. I made a pot of black coffee, the aroma cutting through the stillness like a reminder of the many dawns I had spent in a warehouse office while Julian was still in boarding school. He always thought the money just appeared, a natural resource like rainwater. He never understood that every dollar in his trust was a decision I had made in a room full of men who hoped I would blink first. I sat at my desk, a heavy slab of reclaimed oak, and pulled the Aurelius tech file from the bottom drawer. It was thin, as most tech startups are before they begin to bleed, but the signatures on the final page were thick with ink. I ran my finger over Julian's looping, optimistic script and Elena's sharp, aggressive slant. They hadn't just signed for the money, they had signed for the oversight. The $500,000 wasn't a gift, though Elena's behavior at the gallery suggested she viewed it as a tribute. It was a structured convertible note with a very specific right of first refusal and a major investor clause that I had insisted upon. Not because I wanted to control Julian, but because I know how quickly a young man's head can be turned by a woman who values the stage more than the play. I began to spread the documents across the desk, the paper crinkling, a sound more satisfying to me than any applause. I remembered the day they came to ask for the funding. Elena had done all the talking, weaving a tapestry of disruption and scalability, while Julian nodded along like a buoy in her wake. I had listened for 2 hours, saying nothing, letting the silence grow until Elena started to fidget with her pearls. Silence makes the insecure reveal their hand. She had eventually admitted they were over-leveraged on their personal lease to maintain the image of a successful founder. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just investing in a company. I was buying an insurance policy against their inevitable arrogance. I pulled up the corporate bylaws they had adopted, standard templates they'd pulled off the internet to save on legal fees. A fatal mistake. If they had hired a real firm, someone might have noticed the amendment I slipped into the information rights section of our side letter. It stated that as a major investor, I was entitled to a full audit of all accounts, including promotional and entertainment expenses, within 48 hours of a written request if the company missed its first quarter growth milestone. I looked at the calendar. They had missed that milestone by 3 weeks, a fact Julian had tried to hide behind a flurry of user engagement metrics that meant absolutely nothing to a woman who understands a balance sheet. They thought I wouldn't check. They thought I was the bank of grandma, a vault with no eyes. They were currently at a post-launch brunch, likely ordering mimosas on the company card, celebrating a successful night where they had effectively locked out the only person keeping their lights on. I didn't call my lawyer yet. Instead, I spent the afternoon reviewing the vendor list for the launch party, the catering, the lighting, the exclusive gallery rental. It was all there, invoiced to the company. My money wasn't going towards software development. It was paying for Elena's social climb. I felt a flicker of something, not anger, but a profound sense of correction. A structure that is built on a lie cannot be allowed to stand. It is a safety hazard. I wrote a single, formal letter on my personal stationery. No, dear Julian, no, I was hurt last night. Just a formal demand for inspection of books and records, citing the specific clauses and the missed milestones. I scheduled the courier for 9 a.m. Monday. I wanted them to have Sunday to enjoy their delusions of grandeur. It's important to let people feel the full height of their climb before you remind them who owns the mountain. The weekend passed in a peaceful blur of gardening and reading. I didn't check my phone. I knew Julian would be trying to call once he realized the founding family branding didn't include a shield against his own contracts. By Sunday evening, I was sitting on my patio, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. Elena had wanted a tight circle. She was about to find out how small that circle gets when the funding dries up and the audit begins. People like her always assume that the elderly are past their prime, forgetting that we are the ones who defined the prime in the first place. We have the one thing they can never buy, the patience to wait for the paperwork to do the screaming for us. Monday morning arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes a controlled demolition. I watched from my breakfast nook as the courier's bike pulled away from my driveway, carrying a manila envelope that weighed less than a pound but contained enough contractual gravity to ground Julian's soaring startup. I didn't follow up with a phone call. I didn't send a just checking in text. I simply sat with my tea and watched the clock. At 9:47 a.m., the first vibration hummed against the stone countertop. Julian! I let it ring. At 9:52 a.m., it hummed again. This time, a text followed. Mom, what is this? There's a mistake in the paperwork the courier brought. Call me. I didn't call. I went to the garden and pruned the hydrangeas. The discipline of gardening is not unlike the discipline of debt collection. You have to know what to cut so the rest can survive. By 11:30 a.m., the vibrations were constant. Then came the shift. The caller ID changed to Elena. I smiled. She was the one who handled the outward-facing communications, which in her mind meant spinning reality until it suited her reflection. I finally picked up on the fourth ring, not because I was ready to talk, but because the silence had done its work. She was breathless, her voice tight with a forced, sugary concern that didn't quite reach her eyes, even over the phone. Evelyn, darling, there's been a massive misunderstanding with the bank. Julian is spiraling, and we have a board meeting in an hour. Can you just tell the auditors to stand down so we can clear this up? There is no misunderstanding, Elena, I said, my voice as level as a horizon line. There is a contract, and according to the ledger I reviewed this morning, your founding family launch party cost $84,000. That's nearly 20% of the initial seed capital, on flowers and lighting. I'm not asking the auditors to stand down. I'm asking them to step in. The silence on the other end of the line was the most honest thing she had ever given me. I could almost hear her calculating, realizing for the first time that the sweet old lady who funded her lifestyle was actually the landlord of her dreams. She tried to pivot, her tone dropping the sugar for a sharp, defensive edge. You're hurting your own son's future over a party invitation. Evelyn, isn't that a bit vindictive? I took a slow breath, enjoying the cool air. I am not hurting his future. Elena, I am auditing his present. If he cannot survive a standard transparency request, he was never going to survive the market. And as for the party, you were the one who established the boundaries. I'm simply honoring them. I hung up before she could respond. I didn't need her excuses. I had her signatures. I walked back into my study and looked at the framed photograph of Julian as a boy. I loved him, but love is not a reason to subsidize a disaster. He had allowed himself to be convinced that my wealth was a safety net rather than a standard to be met. He thought he could ban me from the room and still keep the key to the vault. By mid-afternoon, the quiet power of legal reality began to settle over their bright, shiny world. My attorney called to inform me that the information rights clause had triggered a temporary freeze on the company's discretionary spending account until the audit was satisfied. This meant the second half of the gallery rental, the PR firm's retainer, and Elena's personal consulting fee were all currently stuck in limbo. They had spent the weekend acting like royalty, unaware that the crown was on a short-term lease. I felt no joy in it, only the profound satisfaction of a ledger coming back into balance. When you treat people as obstacles to be managed, you shouldn't be surprised when they turn into the walls that hem you in. The silence of my house on Tuesday morning was interrupted not by a phone call, but by the heavy, familiar sound of Julian's SUV pulling into the gravel driveway. I didn't get up. I didn't rush to the door with the frantic energy of a mother worried about her son's distress. I stayed in my wingback chair, turning the page of a book on 18th century architecture. Structure, as always, was my focus. When he finally let himself in, using the spare key I really should have changed, he looked older. The bravado of the launch party had evaporated, leaving behind a man who realized he had built his house on sand. He didn't come in shouting. He came in slumping. He sat across from me, his head in his hands, and for a long moment the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Silence is a mirror. It forces a man to look at himself when there's no noise to distract him. "Mom, Elena is in tears," he finally said, his voice cracking. "The PR firm is threatening to quit because their retainer check bounced. The auditors are at the office right now, going through every receipt. It's embarrassing. You're making us look like we're running a scam." I didn't look up from my book immediately. I finished the paragraph, then marked my place with a silver ribbon. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy who used to hide his broken toys under the bed, hoping I wouldn't notice. "I am not making you look like anything, Julian," I said softly. "I am simply looking at what you have made. If an audit looks like a scam, that is a problem with the math, not the auditor." He tried to explain. He talked about market perception and brand equity. He told me that Elena said the launch party was a necessary expense to attract the right kind of people. I listened, my face a mask of polite interest, while mentally comparing his words to the spreadsheet the auditors had already begun to leak to my legal team. The necessary expenses included a $12,000 wardrobe allowance for Elena and a first-class trip to Miami for a networking retreat that resulted in exactly 0 new leads. Julian wasn't a CEO. He was a husband trying to buy his wife's approval with my capital. He assumed that because I am his mother, my money was an extension of his inheritance, available for early withdrawal without the burden of accountability. He forgot that in my world, there is no such thing as a free lunch, especially when you forget to invite the person paying for the catering. I stood up and walked to my desk, picking up a folder. It contained the receipts for the last 3 years of his life, the house down payment, the car, the bridge loans that were never repaid. I didn't throw them at him. I laid them out on the coffee table, one by one, like tarot cards predicting a very specific future. "You told me this company was about disruption, Julian. Well, consider this a disruption. I am not calling off the auditors. In fact, I've instructed them to look into the personal commingling of funds." His face went pale. He knew as well as I did that if they found company money being used for their personal mortgage, it wasn't just a breach of contract, it was a breach of the law. He looked at me, then with a flash of anger, the first sign of spine he'd shown all day. "You'd really let me go down for this? Your own son?" I didn't blink. I didn't recoil. "I am saving you from becoming a man who thinks rules are for people with less money than him," I replied. "That is the greatest gift a mother can give." He stayed for another hour, moving through the stages of grief, denial, anger, and finally the pathetic bargaining of a man who knows he has no leverage. He asked for a grace period. He promised to fire the PR firm. He even offered to have Elena call and apologize. I told him apologies are for spilling wine, not for violating fiduciary duties. When he finally left, the house felt larger, cleaner. I wasn't just setting a boundary. I was performing an exorcism of the entitlement that had rotted my family tree. The audit report arrived on Thursday afternoon, bound in a sober blue folder that felt significantly heavier than the dreams Julian had sold me. I didn't read it in a rush. I waited until I had finished my tea and the late afternoon sun was casting long, skeletal shadows across my office floor. The numbers didn't lie, but they did tell a story of breathtaking vanity. Elena hadn't just been branding, she had been treating the company treasury like a personal lottery win. There were invoices for consulting that led directly to her sister's shell company, and research trips to Aspen that appeared to consist entirely of spa treatments and private skiing lessons. My son had signed off on every single one of them, his signature a frantic, messy scribble of a man trying to keep a fire from consuming his home, not realizing he was the one holding the match. The following morning, Elena didn't call. She showed up. She didn't use the back door or the spare key. She rang the front bell, a formal visitor seeking an audience. When I opened the door, she was dressed in a sharp, ivory suit, the uniform of a woman who believes that if she looks successful enough, the facts will eventually surrender. She didn't wait to be invited in. She walked past me into the drawing room and stood by the fireplace, her posture rigid. "We can settle this, Evelyn," she began, her voice brittle but controlled. "I've spoken to a few of our other prospective investors. They're willing to buy out your position at a premium. You get your money back plus 20%, and we all walk away. No more audits, no more family drama." I leaned against the doorframe, watching her. It was a classic move, the desperate buyback. She thought this was about the $500,000. She thought I was a shark looking for a meal rather than a gardener looking for a weed. And where would this money come from, Elena? I asked quietly. The prospective investors you haven't secured yet? Or were you planning on taking out another high-interest loan against Julian's remaining equity? Her eyes flickered. I had hit the mark. She wasn't offering me a way out. She was offering me a bribe to stop looking at the crime scene. When I didn't respond immediately, she took a step closer, her mask finally beginning to slip. "Think about the optics. Evelyn, if you push this, the company dies. Julian's reputation is ruined. You'll be the grandmother who sued her own son into bankruptcy. Is your pride really worth his entire future?" It was the ultimate weapon of the entitled, using the victim's own empathy as a shield for their greed. But she had forgotten that I had spent 30 years in logistics. I knew that sometimes to save the cargo, you have to let the sinking ship go. I didn't feel pride. I felt a cold, crystalline sense of duty. "My pride has nothing to do with this," I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the heavy weight that anchors a room. "But my standards do. You think you're protecting Julian's future, but you're actually just protecting your own access. I've already sent the audit findings to the board of the incubator program you're trying to join. I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it because they have a right to know that their founding family is built on misappropriated funds." The color drained from her face so quickly she looked like a ghost in an expensive suit. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of a vacuum sealing. She realized then that I wasn't playing a game of chicken. I had already cleared the road. She left without another word, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the hardwood. She had come to negotiate a surrender, but I had already moved on to the sentencing. I sat back down at my desk and picked up my pen. There was one more document to sign, the one that would officially transition my debt into an equity stake large enough to seize control of the board. They wanted to keep the circle tight. I was simply ensuring I was the one holding the compass. The final meeting took place in a small, windowless conference room, far from the polished marble of the art gallery. There was no champagne. There were no photographers. It was just Julian, Elena, two lawyers, and the crushing weight of the paperwork I had spent the last 7 days preparing. Elena was silent for once, her ivory suit replaced by a dark, muted gray that made her blend into the shadows. Julian looked at me with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. They had spent the weekend trying to find a loophole, a way to spin the misappropriated funds as pre-approved distributions, but they were fighting against a structure I had built decades before they even met. My attorney placed the restructuring agreement on the table. It was the final move in a game they hadn't realized I was playing. By triggering the default clauses in the convertible note, I wasn't just asking for my money back. I was exercising my right to convert that debt into a supervoting class of shares. In one quiet, ink-stained moment, I had become the 80% owner of Aurelius Tech. I wasn't an investor anymore. I was the chairman of the board. Section 8, I said, pointing to the line near the bottom. The board, which now consists of myself and my appointed counsel, has voted to terminate the CEO and the chief brand officer, effective immediately. The company will be placed into a structured wind-down. The remaining intellectual property will be sold to cover the outstanding debts, and the surplus will be placed into a restricted trust for Julian's future, provided he completes a 3-year course in forensic accounting. Elena finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a whisper. You're destroying it. All of it. Just because I didn't let you into a party. I leaned forward, the light catching the silver in my hair. No, Elena, I'm destroying it because you thought the party was more important than the foundation. You didn't ban me because of branding. You banned me because you were afraid I would see the cracks in the walls. And I did. I saw them the moment you signed that first unauthorized check. I turned to my son. Julian, the SUV is in the company's name. The keys are on the table, please. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a lesson being learned at the highest possible tuition. They walked out of that building into the bright, unforgiving light of a world they no longer owned. I stayed behind for a moment, straightening the papers into a perfect, aligned stack. There was no drama in my heart, only a profound sense of cleanliness. I had removed the rot before it could kill the tree. Dignity isn't something you demand from others. It's something you maintain through the quiet, relentless enforcement of your own standards. I didn't lose a son that day. I began the long, slow process of reclaiming one from the person who had tried to turn him into a trophy. Revenge is a loud, messy emotion that leaves everyone burnt. Justice, however, is a cold, structural reality. It is the sound of a pen on a page, the click of a lock, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing you never have to raise your voice when the paperwork is already doing the shouting. Preparation is the only form of protection that never expires. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to let the paperwork speak for you when your words weren't being heard? Subscribe to Vintage Vengeance for more stories of quiet power and senior justice.